All right. I know we're getting to the end of the day. Am I the last speaker?
No.
There's still some more. Still one more. What's that? You want me to just sit down? Just sit right here. All right. For those that don't know about space and time, I'm happy to spend the next 10, 15 minutes with you talking about space and time. I think that last conversation was really insightful, right? How do we get more applications into Web3? We like to focus a lot on financial transactions, right? What kind of chain can do what type of transactions? What's the TPS on these transactions? A little bit closer. What's the speed on these transactions? How much workload can we put on these transactions? I think the one thing that's really interesting when you're talking about the building of apps is we need more developer tools within Web3. And we need developer tools that can be connected to blockchain applications just like you would in AWS. I mean, look, the developer lifecycle is not I go to a chain, I decide like what chain I want to build on, like depending on the TPS, and I start to build. The developer lifecycle, even in Web3, is I go to AWS or I go to Google and I spin up a cloud instance and I look at the EC2 nodes and I spin those up. And so at the end of the day, like we need to meet developers where developers are. We want more developers in Web3. They need to be building applications in Web3. The vast majority of data in Web3 is, or the vast majority of data, period, is not financial transactions. The vast majority of data sits off-chain. It sits in databases all over the place. And so to bring those applications on-chain, we need a way for them to be built in a way that developers are used to it. We look at just some simple facts. Some simple facts about developers in the community is pretty staggering. Number one is that active developers in Web3, they're down, right? They've been down since the bull, around 24%. The other number that we're seeing across the board is new developers coming into Web3, half of them don't even make it a year. So new developers come in, they're all excited, they've seen their friends doing it, they see price action in the market, they believe that Web3 is the future, they come in, they try it out, and ultimately they end up leaving after a year. And I think the other thing that we're seeing, and I'm sure that you're seeing it from this conference, is there's so many L1s and L2s being built, right? So you come in and you have all these different layer 1s and layer 2s that are being built. Where do I start? And typically, sadly, a lot of developers will start in Web3 because ultimately they'll say, like, who will give me a grant? And depending on that grant, I'll kind of build on that layer 1 or layer 2, depending on, like, obviously if there's TPS restrictions, like somebody might choose a move chain versus like an L1 or an L2 rollup. But sadly, like this whole like where do developers build today, it's actually flipped within Web3. It's kind of like I'll build on a chain that gives me money and I'll see how it goes. And in a couple years, if it doesn't work, I'll go to another chain and say, hey, will you guys give me money? And if they give me money, then I'll just move to a different chain and continue to build applications. Ultimately, that's backwards, right? I already talked about how when you're building in Web 2, yes, you can get credits from Microsoft and AWS and Azure, but those credits are to help you build your product, and ultimately you have to go build your community, you have to build your application and your users. And so what we have seen and why we started Space and Time is that Web3 has a database issue, has a database layer issue. Ultimately, if you want to build, and I always joke about this, if you've been in this industry long enough and you're building a GameFi application or you're building a DeFi application, if you're here long enough and don't succeed, these GameFi and these DeFi applications turn into like a gaming database or a DeFi database. And the reason it happens is because as you're building your applications, right, and because there's a database void within native Web3 application development within databases, is they have to go build their own database processes. They have to go build their own data pipelines. And ultimately, if a project ends up failing, they say, well, I don't have the users, like we don't have the MAUs if we're building a game, but ultimately, like I have this really cool like gaming data pipeline that the next person building a gaming application can use, right? Because I've gone and I spent the money. And VCs will give people money all the time and say, hey, go build an awesome game. Well, unfortunately, half that money is being spilt on building out data pipelines. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you've decided, like, I want to build on Polygon, right? If you're building on Polygon, you've got to index that data. We all know that the indexers today in the industry are insufficient and they don't necessarily collect all the data from the chain. You have to hire engineers. You have to ETL this data into AWS or into Google, and you got to choose your cloud provider. And sure, they might give you some credits, but then you need to land that in a database. So now you have maybe a Postgres database, then you have a Snowflake database. You have to ETL this together. You have to choose how you want to store this data, what's going to be in hot storage, what's going to be in cold storage, depending on the response rates that you need for your application. Because just like in the discussion we heard earlier, if you're swiping right or swiping left on an application, like, yeah, that's maybe a transaction is occurring in between those swipes, but ultimately the vast majority of that data is like, who is the user? Where do they live? Like, what are their pictures that they're uploading? Like, what's the algorithm that's matching you before you can even swipe? Like, all of that data today sits off-chain in a centralized database. So long story short is, people are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, building their unique data pipelines because Web3 has a massive, database problem. Let's see, did I skip over a slide? No, I think there's a little slide, but that's fine. Crypto needs a familiar SQL database to onboard the next users, right? You can't go through this, I got to index every chain, I got to go set up my cloud provider. Like I've talked about this ad nauseum already. You can't do it, right? You need to be able to integrate the data from a chain where you can go build applications and people can focus on their front end. Go focus on building amazing games. Don't focus on spinning up databases, indexing chains. And let's face it, even if you do all of that perfectly today, if you say, hey, look, Nate, you have a database company, it's a Web3 native database company, but I got great engineers and we're just going to do it anyways. Even if you do it perfectly and you do it efficiently and AWS on Redshift, et cetera, the problem is you can never connect that data off-chain back to the chain from a smart contract perspective. And the reason you can is because that off-chain database that you built is a single source, right? We're not talking price feeds or weather data. We're talking about an actual algorithm that's matching, A plus B as you're building your application. Well, that's a single source. You're not going to go replicate that data pipeline 10 times and compute that algorithm 10 times to draw consensus on that algorithm in order to send something back to a smart contract. So when you do option price history, for example, in DeFi, you have a single unit coming from a single source that can't be connected back on chain. So let's talk about what space and time actually is at its core. Space and time is, you can think about it as the database for blockchains. We ingest the major chains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Sui, Aptos, ZK Sync, Polygon, etc. We index the full chain. We index up to the tip of the chain. So you have real-time streaming data going into space and time. Within space and time, you have a decentralized database, right? So nation-state protection, right? You have replications of the data, just like you would a data warehouse, but it has replication from a data storage perspective. The important thing to note is within the database, you have a ZK verifier, right? So you can actually verify what is being processed within the database, so you can actually write something back to the chain, which has the result of a query, and it actually has the proof of the query. So it solves this issue of, okay, I've created this data process off-chain, and I want to go make sure that I have an airdrop to users in a game that achieve a certain level, but yet I want to make sure that only the people that actually met that level within that game get that airdrop, not the developer's 10 friends plus the people that actually got that. And so what it does is it enables that you can actually manipulate the process within the database as you're connecting something back to a blockchain. And this is a slide I wanted to bring up earlier, but ultimately you have vectors, right, within Web3. You have the vector of scalability, right? You just heard the scalability from a financial transaction perspective, and then you have the vector of like verifiability and provability. Space and time is unique because it solves the enterprise scale need of an enterprise data warehouse. You think Snowflake and Databricks, right? It solves the capability to do hundreds of terabytes of computation within space and time, but it solves the provability and the verifiable need, right? So you can actually prove what's happening in the database, and you can connect it back to the chain, obviously to make smart contracts smarter. I mean, I think the challenging thing in the industry today is smart contracts aren't smart. right? Like you can't ask very basic questions about a chain. You can't say like, show me all the transactions that I've done, in the last 10 days, or show me the liquidity that's across multiple chains, et cetera. And so in order to do that, right, these are very basic questions as you're building applications in Web 2 that can't be done in Web 3 without something like space and time. So look, you can go through, and I could go through each of these boxes and talk about use cases. I talked about GameFi. I've talked about DeFi. If you want to talk about, like, for example, restaking. Everyone loves talking about restaking right now. Great. Like, how are you going to actually prove slashing, right? How is the slashing actually going to occur where it's verifiable and transparent, right? Today, it can't occur without a ZK coprocessor. And so there's application and use cases across all of these different vectors within and verticals within the industry. But I think our message is pretty straightforward from a space and time perspective. It's no secret that our largest investor is Microsoft, that we're building a future of verifiability with Microsoft and with our partners across the industry. But ultimately, when Web3 developers, or when developers in general want to come build Web3 applications, it's got to start at the database level. Ultimately, we can determine where you want to write your smart contracts to, and space and time allows you to do that. So if you come in, you start building applications, you start building on space and time, and you decide you want to deploy something to Sui, great, go deploy a smart contract to Sui. If you want to deploy it to Aptos, awesome, go do that. If you want to do it to ZK Sync Era, awesome, go do that. And space and time enables all of that, right? So as an endpoint for transaction settlement, you can choose where you want to deploy your smart contracts. But it's something that we're passionate about. We think that there's a major database issue. We think people are spending a tremendous amount of money, customizing these across the industry, and we invite you to try it out. From an L2 perspective and an L1 perspective, it all comes down to users. If you want more users, you have to have more integrated services to make it easier for them to build. Else you're just leaving them to the wolves of Web 2 cloud, right? Go spin up your own cloud, go choose your own database, go hire your own engineers, go index our data, good luck with it, and ultimately you have an application that is centralized that is running transactions on a blockchain. So we invite you to come try it out, and thanks for having me.